On August 12, 1853, two trains collided head-on in Valley Falls, Rhode Island. 14 people were killed. Approximately 40 more were wounded. The investigation found a single cause. The conductor's watch was 2 minutes off. 2 minutes, that's all it took. Because in 1853 there was no agreed-upon time in America. Every town, every railroad, every church steeple kept its own clock. And when two clocks disagreed by 120 seconds on a stretch of single track, 14 families buried someone that week. It was the first train wreck ever photographed. The daguerreotype went viral in illustrated newspapers across the country, and it should have changed everything. But it did not. For another 30 years, America continued operating with over 300 different local times, 300 versions of noon, 300 definitions of when the day began. And when the change finally came, it was not the government that imposed it. It was a private industry. The railroads decided what time it was, and everyone else simply obeyed. I came to this through etymology. I was researching the origin of the phrase "on time," trying to understand when punctuality became a moral virtue in American life, because it has not always been one. Before the 1880s, the concept of being late did not carry the weight it carries now. How could it? If your town's noon was 3 minutes different from the next town's noon, and 7 minutes different from the railroad's noon, who exactly was late? But the deeper I went, the less the story was about language and the more it was about control. What I found was not just a logistical problem that got solved. It was an entire relationship between human beings and the natural world that got severed. In a single afternoon, by a single industry, without a single vote. For most of human history, time was local. Noon meant the moment the sun reached its highest point in the sky directly above you, not above the next town, not above a city 200 miles away. Above you, this was not approximate, this was astronomy. Communities measured it carefully, a church steeple, a jeweler's window, a courthouse clock. Someone in every town was responsible for observing the sun and setting the local standard. This meant that when it was noon in Boston, it was 11:57 in Worcester. When it was noon in Chicago, it was 11:50 in St. Louis, 11:48 in Dubuque, 11:41 in St. Paul, and 11:27 in Omaha. Every 69 miles you traveled west, the local noon shifted by approximately 4 minutes. Not because anyone was wrong, because the earth is round and the sun moves. There were 23 different local times in Indiana alone, 38 in Michigan. The Library of Congress confirms that more than 300 local sun times were in active use across the United States by the early 1880s. And for most Americans, this wasn't chaos. It was normal. If you were a farmer in Ohio, you didn't need to know what time it was in Philadelphia. You needed to know when the sun rose, when it set, and when your neighbor expected you for dinner. Time was a relationship between you and the sky. It belonged to the place where you stood. This system had operated for the entire span of recorded civilization. Every culture on Earth kept local solar time. The sundial, the obelisk, the water clock, the church bell, all anchored to the same principle. Noon is when the sun is overhead. That was not opinion, that was physics. Then the railroads arrived, and with them, a problem that had never existed before in human history: speed. Before railroads, the fastest most Americans traveled was the speed of a horse. At that pace, the 4-minute time shift every 69 miles was imperceptible. You would never notice it. But a train covering that distance in an hour made the shift unavoidable. And when multiple railroad companies operated on the same tracks, each running on the local time of their home city, the results were exactly what you would expect. If you got off a train in Buffalo, New York, you would look up and see 3 or 4 different clocks on the station wall. One set to New York Central Time, one set to trains coming out of Boston, one showing local Buffalo time. All of them different from the watch in your pocket. Railroad timetables in major cities listed dozens of different arrival and departure times for the same train, each pegged to a different local standard. The Indianapolis Sentinel captured the absurdity in a single editorial line. The sun is no longer to boss the job. They weren't being metaphorical. They were describing a literal power transfer. For the entirety of human existence, the sun had determined when it was noon. Now a railroad timetable would. The man at the center of this was not a politician, not a scientist. He was a school principal. Charles Ferdinand Dowd, co-principal of a girls' seminary in Saratoga Springs, New York, first proposed dividing the country into time zones in 1869, the same year the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. He published a pamphlet in 1870 titled A System of National Time for Railroads. He laid out 4 zones, each 15 degrees of longitude wide, each 1 hour apart: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. The same structure we use today. A schoolteacher drew the blueprint that governs the daily schedule of 330 million Americans. But the railroads didn't adopt his plan. Not yet. Nearly 500 railroad companies objected, not on scientific grounds, on competitive grounds. Nobody wanted to cede control of their timetable to a shared standard. Congress was asked to intervene in 1809, in 1870, and again in 1872. Each time, the proposal was rejected. It took another man to make it happen. William F. Allen was editor of the Traveler's Official Railway Guide and secretary of the General Time Convention. Allen took Dowd's framework, refined it, and in 1881 began a methodical campaign to sell the plan directly to railroad executives. He did not go to Congress, he went to the companies. By 1881, the railroad companies were more powerful than Congress, and they knew it. On October 11, 1883, railroad executives gathered at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago. Allen presented his plan, 5 time zones, with borders drawn not along state lines or rivers, but through railroad stations and junctions. The majority voted yes. The date was set, November 18, 1883, a Sunday chosen deliberately because it was the lightest travel day of the week. Here's what happened next, and I want you to understand how strange this was. At noon on November 18th, the United States Naval Observatory and the Allegheny Observatory in Pittsburgh sent a telegraph signal. Every railroad clock in America was reset simultaneously. In cities on the eastern edge of each new time zone, clocks were turned backward. People experienced noon twice. In cities on the western edge, clocks jumped forward. Minutes simply vanished from the day. Newspapers called it the Day of Two Noons. At the Broad Street station of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a crowd gathered to watch the adjustment, staring at the clock face in bewilderment. In New York, the clock at Western Union's headquarters on Broadway displayed 2 times, side by side, the old and the new. At Independence Hall in Philadelphia, a man named William Harper climbed into the belfry and adjusted the mechanism by hand. It took 10 minutes. Philadelphia's time, shifted by 36 seconds. The city where the Declaration of Independence was signed had its time redefined by a railroad employee in a bell tower. The Indianapolis Sentinel published perhaps the most prescient line written that week. People will have to eat, sleep, work, and marry by railroad time. Ministers will have to preach by railroad time. Banks will open and close by railroad time. They meant it as protest. It reads now as prophecy. Within a year, 85% of American cities with populations over 10,000 had adopted the new standard. Not because Congress told them to. Congress would not ratify railroad time for another 35 years. Cities adopted it because the railroads were their economic lifeline, and you either ran on railroad time or you got left behind. Some cities resisted. Detroit held out for years. It first kept local time, then tried Central Standard, then local mean time again, before finally settling on Eastern Standard in 1916. Washington, D.C. itself refused to adopt Standard Time for years, even as the rest of the country fell in line. The capital of the United States rebelled against railroad time and lost. Maybe I'm seeing connections that aren't there. Maybe the railroad simply solved a logistical problem and everyone benefited. The official story makes sense on the surface. Trains were crashing, schedules were unreadable. Something had to be standardized. Reasonable. But here's what I keep returning to. Congress rejected the idea 3 times, in 1809, in 1870, and in 1872. The elected representatives of the American people said no. And then a private industry did it anyway, without legislation, without a vote, without constitutional authority. The railroads redefined the most basic unit of daily life for every American citizen. And the government simply followed along 35 years later, in 1918, rubber stamping what had already been imposed. Consider the timing. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. Standard time was imposed in 1883. Between those 14 years, the railroad companies became the most powerful corporations in American history. They received 175 million acres of public land through federal land grants, an area larger than Texas. They set freight rates that determined which towns thrived and which towns died. They employed more workers than any other industry, and then they decided what time it was. The same decade that replaced local currencies with national banking. The same decade that replaced community-based identity with census documentation. The same decade that replaced guild systems with wage labor. And now the same decade that replaced the sun with a railroad timetable. Not coincidence. Pattern. And the man who started it all, Charles Dowd, the schoolteacher who first proposed time zones in 1869, spent the rest of his life fighting for recognition, watching William Allen receive the credit for his system. He was working on an international standard time proposal when, on November 12, 1904, at approximately 5:30 in the evening, he was struck and killed by a train at an ungated railroad crossing in Saratoga Springs. His body was thrown 30 feet. The coroner declared the railroad company wholly responsible for his death. The man who gave the railroads their time was killed by the railroads at a crossing they had not bothered to gate. Time magazine later called it a final irony. I would call it something else entirely. Here is what stays with me. The language remembers. We still say AM and PM, ante meridiem and post meridiem, before and after the sun crosses the meridian, before and after noon. But the noon we reference no longer has anything to do with the sun's actual position. In most of America, solar noon and clock noon differ by anywhere from 10 to 40 minutes depending on where you stand within your time zone. The words we use to tell time still describe a relationship with the sun that was severed in 1883. Airline pilots today use Universal Coordinated Time, a single global standard for every flight on Earth. The sun's position is irrelevant at 35,000 feet. We live in William Allen's world now, not Charles Dowd's, and certainly not the sun's. Every meeting you schedule, every alarm you set, every deadline you calculate traces back to a decision made by railroad executives at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago on October 11, 1883. That hotel, by the way, was demolished. It was replaced by what became the Continental Illinois Bank Building, later renamed the Central Standard Building, in honor of what happened there. A hotel where time was rewritten, torn down and replaced by a bank. The symbolism is almost too precise. The questions remain. Why did a private industry get to redefine the most basic unit of daily life for an entire nation? Why did Congress reject the idea 3 times and then let the railroads do it anyway? Why was the man who invented the system killed by the industry that profited from it at a crossing they refused to make safe? Why did it take 35 years for the government to legally ratify a change that had already been imposed on every American citizen? And why, when you look at the decade that transformed America, do you keep finding the same structure? A system that served communities for centuries was replaced in a single moment by something that served an industry. Local currencies replaced by national banking. Local identity replaced by federal documentation, local craftsmanship replaced by wage labor, and local time, the one thing that connected every human being to the actual, physical, observable movement of the sun, was replaced by a telegraph signal sent from a naval observatory at the request of railroad executives. 300 different times existed in America until 1883. 300 communities measuring their days by the sky above them. Then one afternoon, a telegraph clicked. A clock hand moved, and an entire nation was synchronized to a schedule designed not for people, but for freight. I do not have answers, only patterns. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. If you have made it this far, you already see it. Subscribe, because the next one goes deeper.